So I have made a prezi to talk about my presentation. It's about different cultures, same way out, 20th century feminine oppression in two texts, Green Chrysanthemum and The Awakening. Is anybody familiar with either of these texts, Green Chrysanthemum or The Awakening? Kahi, Becca, yeah, you guys, Green Chrysanthemum is something that we read in Dr. Peterson's Advanced Modern Translation class for literature. And I read that this semester and thought immediately of The Awakening. We're going to talk about a little bit what those are so you can understand better. But here are the two pieces of literature that I'm going to look at. I'm going to do a historical, feminist, critical analysis, comparative literature with Kate Chapin's The Awakening and Anzu Gear's Green Chrysanthemum. We're going to talk more about the text and the stories in a second, but first, let's check out women in the early 20th century in Korea and in America. So, as we learned in this class, Korean history really takes off in the 20th century, starting from either the pre-World War I period through World War I. We have the Japanese occupation, we have World War II, and then into the Korean War and modernity. And throughout, from the Japanese period until after the Korean War, throughout there is a tension in Korea, not just for women, but for society, between tradition and modernity, between our old Confucian values and these new westernized things that we are being introduced to in our lives. Technology, new forms of government, all these things that are kind of clashing with our old traditional values. America is similar. We're coming out of the Victorian era, and this is a woman in turn of the century. I mean, this is like 1900. Contrast that with what you know of like a 1950s woman, 50 years later. It's a short span of time, but look how differently women dress, women present themselves. It's a time of cultural change for women. So, The Awakening and Green Chrysanthemum. I'm going to talk about why we're going to compare these two. So first of all, The Awakening, Kate Chapin is an American author. She's clearly a woman named Kate. It's published in 1899. Whereas Green Chrysanthemum is published in 1954 by a Korean man, Anzu Gear. So we're going to have a couple of warring elements in these two interpretations. The stories themselves are very similar, but Kate Chapin is writing specifically about gender politics, about gender bias. It is feminist literature, The Awakening, and one of the earliest and most significant examples of feminist literature in America. While Green Chrysanthemum, though it treats feminist themes quite heavily, is not focused entirely on feminism. There are other issues that Anzu Gear is treating. He is not writing to women about their status. He is writing to Koreans in general about a clash of cultures. And clearly he's a man, Kate Chapin is a woman, and so we're going to have differences in stylistics and differences in intent. I also listed the settings here. We have New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico, where The Awakening is set, and Yongin in Gyeonggi-do, where Green Chrysanthemum is set, where I served. Shout out. Okay, so a little bit of the plot of The Awakening. We have our main lady, Edna Pontellier. I don't speak French, and I'm not going to try, so you can deal with my Cajun pronunciation. She's a Cajun lady. She's from New Orleans. They're French-speaking and American-speaking. Her husband's name is Léonce. They have two sons, and the story opens in Mexico. They're on vacation. Now, Edna is a typical turn-of-the-century woman. She's got two kids and her happy life. Her life really revolves around her feminine roles, and that is all. Léonce is her husband, and he kind of puts her down, kind of treats her like a servant, like someone whose entire purpose of existing is to bring him food and take care of their kids. And so they have this kind of tense dynamic, but they're on vacation in Mexico, and Edna meets this lady named Adele. Adele is the conservative foil to Edna. She is a wife and a mother as well, and she is perfectly content in her role. She wants nothing more than to be what she is and be what society dictates that she is. Now, Lance kind of neglects Edna on this trip. He kind of does his own thing, leaves Edna to kind of take care of everything, and a man starts to notice Edna. His name is Robert. Robert pursues Edna, and she starts to feel what may be true love, what may be true purpose for the first time. But she's married, clearly, so she stops his advances. He really likes her, he lets her know, and she says, no, I'm married. And they go back to New Orleans. However, this experience kind of changes her entire outlook on life. She starts thinking, this is not, like, what I am dictated by society is not what I am as a person. And she kind of takes it in the hyperbolic direction and pursues an affair with this guy named Alcé Audubon. Their relationship is based completely on sexual love. extramarital sex. And so she realizes too, after this affair with Alcée Arobon, that this is not where happiness is found either, and breaks it off with him. She also finds a positive foil in New Orleans in Mademoiselle Rice, a liberal pianist. She's not married, she lives alone, she has a career, and she kind of encourages Edna to be more liberal. Now, her lover, Robert, returns to New Orleans and confesses his love to Edna, and she really wants to go with him. But as he's confessing his love, she gets news that Adele, her good friend, is in childbirth and needs help. So she goes to help Adele. When she comes back to her house, Robert has left her a note that says, "Sorry, hon, I'm gone." And Edna can't bear the thought of going on with her husband. She can't bear the thought that Robert is already gone, so she drowns herself. This is incredibly similar to the plot of Green Chrysanthemum, a Korean short story from the same period. However, it has different cultural elements that tell us a lot about how different cultural roles were perceived and understood at the time. Our protagonist in Green Chrysanthemum is a girl named Puni. She is a minyori, and that means it's a kind of marriage that was perpetuated by like the late Chosun and right into through the Japanese period, if the dates of this story are to be believed. A minyori marriage is when a girl from a poor family is sold into the home of a slightly richer family. Maybe the poor family has too many children, and they need money, so they sell off one of their daughters into a richer home, and that daughter becomes the servant of the richer home until she becomes marriageable age, and she marries one of the sons in the family and comes into the family that way. That was minyori marriage, and so Puni is a minyori, and she, in this marriage situation, has been forced to marry this guy, Pak. Pak, however, is a eunuch, so she's basically forced into marriage and forced to marry a eunuch. Now, where Leonce, Edna's husband, he's a nice guy. He doesn't really get feminism, but he's just a normal guy of the period. Pak is not portrayed very happily. He's kind of an angry man. He scratches Buni, he asks her to do like random stuff. He's not a positive character, and Buni hates living with him. Luckily, the status of eunuchs in society declines after the Chosun period, and their fantastic house in Seoul, they have to move into a smaller one and a smaller one, and eventually they send Puni and her mother-in-law out to live on the farm, and farm it themselves, their love and life out there away from Puni's husband, this Pak guy. But they get news that Pak and his family are moving back to the house, so they're dealing with that news when the story begins. Puni, she meets this guy named E out by the well. When she goes out to get water, she meets this dashing young man named E. And like in The Awakening, she starts to feel like maybe there is more to her life than serving men. E loves Buni, and he wants her to run away with him. But she's not sure. She doesn't give him a specific answer because she has her mother-in-law. This is an interesting element of this story as compared to most Korean literature. There's a whole genre of Korean literature called mother-in-law literature. The mother-in-law is generally this terrible figure who bosses around the daughter-in-law and just makes her life a living hell. But in this story, Buni and the mother-in-law are actually really good friends. And so Buni feels really bad, doesn't want to leave her mother-in-law. She's like her tie to life. And so, eventually, with this conflict between should I go with E, should I stay home with my mother-in-law, and obey Confucian values where, as we learned, you don't have two husbands, she can't deal with the conflict of values, and so she does not leave with E, but she cannot spend life with her husband, so she hangs herself. Clearly, okay, we're out of time, but real quick, we'll go through a little bit of the comparisons. These stories are extremely similar with a few varying cultural elements, culminating in the fact that two cultures that are a world apart, we have this literature profiling women who are awakening to the concept of personal liberation, but finding no socially acceptable way out, turn to the same solution, which is, of course, suicide. You can see the parallels right across here. Edna and Buni are this trapped woman, kind of questioning her existence with multiple lovers. We have Leonce and Pak. The unaware males don't know that they're perpetuating this patriarchal order. Robert and E, who may or may not give Puni or Edna a better life. Ties to life being children for Edna. Puni has her mother-in-law to tie her to life. We have a conservative model in Adele, a conservative model in the mother-in-law, but in American culture we have a liberal model in Mademoiselle Rice and a sexual lover in Alcée Arobon, which we do not see in the Korean story. And again, the only escape is suicide, and so I will end there. That's the end of my presentation.